Welcome to today's Explainer. We are unpacking a genuinely unusual, kind of wild entry into Los Angeles politics. We're talking about Spencer Pratt. And yes, I mean the former reality TV villain from The Hills. But we're looking at how a completely devastating, intense personal crisis actually catalyzed his run for mayor of America's second largest city. Through a recent deep dive interview, Pratt outlined this incredibly aggressive, detailed platform that is aimed at literally dismantling the current municipal establishment. So we're going to break down his core arguments, his specific policy proposals, and of course, the personal tragedy that kicked the whole shebang off.
Okay, let's dive into this by going back to the day of the Palisades fire. According to Pratt, it started totally normally, just making his routine morning espresso. But by mid-morning, his nanny spots smoke on a nearby hill. He evacuates his wife and kids, and then later that afternoon, Pratt finds himself completely gridlocked in infamous Los Angeles traffic. And it was right there, literally trapped on the freeway, that he watched his family home burn to the ground, live on his phone's security cameras. Just imagine that for a second. Watching your entire life go up in flames on a tiny little screen while you are stuck in your car, completely helpless. It's a harrowing narrative of a citizen feeling utterly abandoned by the very infrastructure they rely on.
So, to understand how that traumatic day transformed into a mayoral bid, we'll unpack his platform through 5 specific pillars. First, the inciting incident. Second, taking on the system. Third, the NGO battle. Fourth, enforcing city laws. And finally, reviving the economy. Let's start right off the bat with part 1, the inciting incident, specifically looking at his emergency response claims. According to Pratt's recounting of the event, the destruction of his home was a direct result of municipal negligence. He claims that a massive 5 million-gallon reservoir, one designed specifically for wildfire protection right next door to his home, had been inexplicably drained months prior. On top of that, he points out that fixed-wing air support was never called in by city leadership, allegedly because the mayor was in Africa and her deputy was unavailable. But honestly, the most terrifying part? As his house is burning down, he claims 911 operators were actively blocking emergency access to the area, meaning he was completely unable to reach his father, who was still out there trying to save his own home. So, in the immediate aftermath, with all his assets literally tied up in ashes, Pratt turns to social media. He makes an online plea for people to stream his wife Heidi's 15-year-old pop album. Miraculously, it pushes the record to #1, and they raise about $150,000, which sounds amazing, right? But as Pratt quickly realized, wow, that money comes nowhere near the actual cost of rebuilding a life in Los Angeles, especially after being dropped by his insurance provider. This incredibly stark financial reality is exactly what prompted him to sue both the city and the state. Which brings us to part 2, taking on the system, and his decision to actually run for mayor. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how suing the city simply wasn't enough to enact the systemic change he felt was necessary. So pushed by advice from local billionaire Rick Caruso to, quote, go after Bass, meaning the current mayor, Pratt decides to run. But he frames his political identity entirely differently than your typical candidate. He defines his run as a tour of duty. He explicitly rejects the whole career politician model, committing to a maximum of 8 years, just 2 terms, to fix things up before going right back to private life. His stated goal? To completely root out what he labels as socialist and communist leadership in City Hall. He literally views his campaign as a necessary, temporary civic sacrifice for the greater good of LA. All right, part 3, the NGO and homelessness battle. This is a massive systemic critique. Pratt argues that the current NGO system meant to address homelessness is just grossly mismanaged and artificially inflating costs for taxpayers. And he brings receipts. He cites specific examples where a building listed on the open market for $11 million is allegedly scooped up by the city via an NGO for $29 million shortly after. I mean, $11 million to $29 million? Furthermore, he claims that construction costs under these NGO models absolutely skyrocket to $750 per square foot. To put that in perspective, the private developer standard is roughly $250. He alleges this massive discrepancy is due to a deeply entrenched system of kickbacks and zero accountability. For anyone paying local taxes, these are exactly the kinds of numbers that make you stop and pay attention. To combat this, Pratt is proposing a really radical shift. Right now, the current system often places these high-cost units right in dense urban centers, and crucially, without requiring occupants to be drug-free. Actually, scratch that. He knows that restriction is actually tied to state funding rules, but you get the idea. Pratt's proposed alternative? He wants to build nature-based recovery compounds way outside the city center, which is heavily inspired by a highly successful veteran facility in Bentonville.
His entire model centers on mandatory treatment and physically separating vulnerable populations, like single mothers, from hardened addicts. It's a complete 180 from the status quo. Moving into Part 4, enforcing existing city laws to restore order.
Pratt argues vehemently that Los Angeles is experiencing an absolute safety crisis. He claims those official statistics showing a decrease in crime? Completely artificial. Why? Because he believes residents have simply given up calling 911 since the police never show up anyway. So, his plan is to act unilaterally. And this brilliantly illustrates his uncompromising approach. Step 1, post warning signs citywide, unequivocally stating that public drug use, theft, and encampments are over. Done. Step 2, a brief 2 to 3 week grace period. Step 3, strict, zero exception enforcement of the laws already on the books. And Step 4, he actually wants to bring in the CDC to professionally sanitize former encampment areas, citing the presence of what he calls medieval diseases. His whole philosophy on crime is pretty bluntly summarized by this quote he attributes to a famous police chief. Once you start putting handcuffs on people, watch how many people leave. It's direct. Pratt believes that simply enforcing existing laws, without applying what the current administration allegedly calls culturally insensitive exceptions, will rapidly and fundamentally transform the reality on the streets. No new laws, just enforcing the old ones. Finally, Part 5, reviving the Los Angeles economy by cutting red tape. Let's move to and see how this builds. Because Pratt argues economic revival is literally impossible without public safety first. But once the streets are safe, he wants to take a chainsaw to bureaucratic red tape. He's talking about an auto-stamp system for basic small business permits, so a family trying to open a corner bodega or a cafe doesn't have to wait years just to get a piece of paper. For Hollywood, he wants to pivot city support directly to independent filmmakers with massive fee cuts to bring production back home. And for massive infrastructure projects, like that proposed $3 billion convention center expansion, he argues it should only happen if it's entirely privately funded by eager investors, not a single taxpayer dollar drains. And speaking of taxpayer dollars, Pratt is demanding total, uncomfortable transparency across all city budgets, especially education. Look at this staggering figure. He points out that the Los Angeles Unified School District spends roughly $23,000 per student every single year, yet they only achieve a 46% English proficiency rate, less than half. It's an objectively shocking disparity. For Pratt, this metric alone is so unacceptable that it necessitates bringing in specialized criminal investigation teams to conduct a total audit of all city and NGO spending on day one. To wrap up our breakdown of his platform, I think this quote from the interview hits the nail on the head regarding his core motivation. I don't do this to be a politician. I do this to fight, to make sure everyone feels safe on the streets they paid taxes for. It is raw, it is deeply personal, and it was born out of a devastating fire, ultimately transforming into a blueprint for running one of the most complex cities in the world. We've covered the wild origins of his campaign, the stark financial numbers behind his critiques, and his incredibly unyielding action plan, which leaves us with this massive final question. Could a citizen-led, totally anti-establishment approach, driven by personal grievance and a huge demand for order, actually become the new blueprint for America's largest cities? It's a question Los Angeles is going to have to answer at the ballot box, but honestly, the rest of the country should absolutely be watching. Thanks for joining us for this explainer, and we will see you next time.